Hello everyone and welcome back to Bitwig Studio and Music Production. This is lesson 3.04. In this lesson, we're going to talk about our grid settings and also the importance of the shift key. So let's begin with the shift key, and I showed you this in the last video. If I hold shift and I adjust a parameter, I have fine control over that parameter, and you can see that here. I'm not going by very large increments, in some cases as small as 0.02 dB. If I'm not holding shift, it's going to jump by greater values. So in this case, it seems to be going by about 0.2, sometimes 0.3. If I want to set something to its default inside of Bitwig, I can typically just double click. And so it's now put it to 0 dB, but I kind of like it at -10. So I'm going to command click, and now I can type in the value that I want. So -10, wonderful, we're there. Now with automation, the shift control is also very handy, because if I want to get to something, like if I know I want an integer value, I can hold shift, and then usually I can get to either exactly the value, so in this case I got lucky, or it might go to like -5.99, but if I'm just dragging around, it can be a little bit tougher to land on that integer, especially if you're not starting with an integer value. If you're not starting at exactly -10 or at -8, let's say this was at like -8.33, it can be very difficult to get to an integer value. At least that's what I found so far working. So the shift button can be quite handy, and you can tell I'm struggling to get it there now, but that's basically imperceptible differences there. Okay, wanted to show you that first. The other power of the shift key is that when we're doing fine tuning, it actually gives us more freedom. And we're holding shift and we're moving clips around, or we're doing other things inside of Bitwig, it also will give us a lot of freedom. So if I'm holding shift here, you can see that nothing is snapping, and so if I let go, all right, we're not on the grid. We haven't snapped to anything. If I'm just clicking and dragging, it's going to by default snap, and so I can't really get this to align off the grid. And a lot of people have produced music for a long time and have only ever worked on the grid. And that can lead to some pretty boring results, because most people work specifically on the grid. Where your music starts to get interesting is when you start to use the shift key and you start to put things off ever so slightly. So for example, if I just wanted to make a little adjustment, I could do it like that. And suddenly those hundreds and hundreds of people who have been going boom, 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 right on the clicks, yours now becomes a little bit interesting because you've set it off. Even just subtly, it can have a big impact on drum loops, on melodies, on really every single thing you do, even automation controls. Now, notice here when I'm zooming, we're not changing from a quarter note down here. All right, this is what is referred to as the density of the beat time grid. In other words, how many little ticks we're going to see as we zoom in and out. And right now it's set so that no matter what I do, whether I zoom in or out, it's staying at quarter notes, and it's staying at straight quarter notes. That's what this ST is standing for. I can actually adjust this, and I can change it to triplets. So just watch the grid here when I do this. So now you can see we've actually added in more points, more values for us to snap to, and it's going to snap now at triplet values as opposed to straight values. So I'll just go back to straight. You can see that's where it's going to snap, that's where it's going to snap, that's where it's going to snap. I have 1, 2, 3, 4 options. If I go to triplets, I'm going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 options. You can go a little crazier. You can go it out to 5. You can bring it all the way out to 7. How often are you going to be going to 5 or 7? I have no idea, but most likely you'll be working with triplets, or you're going to be working in straight mode. Now, if I want this grid to automatically adapt with my zoom, I can select this icon here, and just like that, it went to 16th notes. So the algorithm has decided that based on where I'm zoomed in, it feels that I would want the control over 16th notes. So if you can count now, we're at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. Okay, pretty cool. So if I zoom out further, it's going to make that grid smaller and smaller and smaller. And if I zoom in, it will make it greater and greater and greater. So this is one case where, again, the shift key could be helpful, because if you're zoomed all the way out and you don't want what you have lining up exactly with the grid, you can hit the shift key and drop it wherever. Now, to go out of this mode, you can just adjust here. All right, and once you start making changes, that automatic grid setting is going to go off. Okay, so let's zoom in quickly, and let's just duplicate this a few times to help us out. Put it at some different points. Okay, cool. And I'm going to go back to quarter notes here. And now we'll look at these three features here. So I'm just going to read to you what Bitwig says about them, and then I'll show you exactly how they work. So the first one says absolute snapping. Enable this option to snap events to beat grid lines during mouse interactions. All right, that seems simple enough. Let's turn off the snap to objects for just a second so that we can see exactly what absolute snapping is doing. We don't need to have our automation up. And so now, as I'm snapping, I'm moving things around, it's always going to go to the nearest indicator here, the nearest snap point. Pretty simple. And the same thing will be true when you are working with automation. Well, not exactly, but when you're moving things around, the automation will start to snap. If I turn this off and I have nothing on, it's basically the same thing as working with the shift button. Okay, only now I don't have to click the shift button. So let's turn that back on for a second, pull it, line it up with the grid. So our second one here is called relative snapping. And this one's a little bit more confusing. You really have to actually kind of see it. What Bitwig says is enable this option if snapping should keep the offset between events and the beat grid unchanged during mouse interactions. What does that mean? Well, it means this. If I pull a clip and I put it off of the grid, for example, all right, and now I have this enabled and I turn off my absolute snapping. When I pull this clip, it's actually going to snap to the same division off the grid. So if I want to go to the 13.1, you can see how it's going, and it's snapping at that point, at the point where I was just off. And you can see I made a little mistake, but it's already compensated for that. And again, it's keeping it that same distance off the grid. So that one is really, really cool. That one is really handy. Especially if you're doing like drum programming and you're doing it from the arrangement view, you can do some stuff like that. And if you're duplicating and duplicating, it will keep it just as far off the grid. The last icon here is the snap to objects, which as I pull closer and closer, it will make sure that it snaps to the object. And so I can line things straight up if I want to do that. So those are all really easy, really straightforward. And so now if I do it and I want to snap to the object and I'm off the grid, I have that same amount of control. Okay, so all three of those are going to come in handy. For now, we'll just turn on the absolute snapping and pull these all back onto equal time divisions here. Last point to mention before we move on is if I double click this and I bring up my note editor panel, we have the exact same controls down here, and we'll have these controls when we're working with MIDI data as well. And these are exactly the same as what you see up here. Only you might have more fine control if you want to look at one specific clip. So you can see we're now working in 30-second notes as compared to quarter notes up at the top. We're going to talk about the distinction between these views and maybe the not so much of a distinction between these views in a couple videos. But for now, that's all I wanted to show you. And hopefully that helps you out with your views and navigating around in the arrangement timeline. I'll catch you again in the next lesson.